The aim of this dissertation is to identify alternatives to the sport interpreter figures through three basic topics such as sport, globalization, and linguistic mediation. The first issue analyzed is the sport and its changes over time. In its earliest forms, physical activity was necessary as a survival factor, while later the Greeks formulated the principles of sport as loyalty and wellness, but especially they were the first that instituted the truce during the Olympic Games. Later, the Etruscans and Romans introduced the concept of sport as entertainment, but mostly they highlighted the figure of spectator, thus moving from a passive to an active form of sports. Today, sports events have become a source of income and advertising, as they have been increasingly accompanied by the mass media. The dissertation focused also on the differences between individual and team sports, explaining the principles which bring to the choice of one of them. By analyzing sport events, it's possible to answer the question, where could these figures work? And by social analysis, we see as sport events are especially mass events. In this regard, two popular events, the Olympics and World Football Cup, have been analyzed. Through these two events, we can affirm that globalization, that is to say, the movement of capital and people, is related to sports events. The achievement of success is related to the movement of capital, people and athletes. An example of sport globalization is the London team of Corinthians, which in 1910 went to teach football in Brazil, and they did so well that the city of São Paulo decided to rename its football team Sport Club Corinthians Paulista. The gathering of a large number of people influences other themes, such as socialization. Indeed, sport socialization is a tangible process. Thanks to linguistic mediation, communication has deepened, which is fundamental in the process of socialization. The linguistic mediator is an agent that mediates between monolingual participants to a conversation, where they belong to two different linguistic communities, and its task is to facilitate understanding on both sides. We analyze the mediation techniques in order to understand how these alternative figures may mediate linguistically, without being true interpreters or translators, but simply as a link between two different languages. In linguistic mediation, the theme of technical languages is largely examined. It's a real milestone, composed of words and specific vocabulary that we need to know in order to facilitate understanding. Through the definition of sport language as technical language, this discipline has been leveled with other most accredited sectors, such as medicine and politics. Indeed, there is a lexical exchange between these technical languages, and even mergers have been created between these fields, such as sports, traumatology, and sports law. Since its foundation, sport language has used foreignism, given the large spread of sports born in other countries, accelerated by globalization. 2014 is the year of the celebration of the centenary of the Christmas truce in World War I. This event is the true symbol of two themes contained in this dissertation, socialization and sport. This process showed how mediation could be done through sport. The story narrates that on Christmas Day of 1914, British and Germans stopped hostilities to get together to play a football game. After a century, the idea that remains is that in the middle of a war, some boys found the courage to turn down the bayonets and look into the eyes of the enemy that someone had designated for them, but this time looking at him as a sport opponent. The alternative figures of linguistic mediators in sports are the sports journalist, the athlete, and the coach. The sport journalist, basically in his studies, doesn't focus on the study of languages and the techniques of interpretation. However, it's possible that the journalist could know a foreign language. For example, he can use it when he has to interact with a foreign athlete who doesn't speak the language of the listeners, or even when the same reporter goes abroad to interview foreign athletes. He engages when he is live in a sort of liaison interpreting, short on time and answers almost always similar in duration, to get the message conveyed to the listeners. Thanks to globalization, athletes and coaches travel constantly, playing for a foreign club or training it. Given that national events do not allow these two figures to be under the spotlight, while in continental, international, or global events become essential, they may replace sport interpreters thanks to the knowledge of a language to socialize. The coach, contrarily to the athlete, is foremost a teacher of sport and must convey these principles to his athlete or team. In addition, he must be an excellent communicator to convey clearly what he wants to transmit to the media. We can talk about coach as a mediator of sports and athletic culture, but also becomes a mediator when there is in a press conference, where it is sportingly speaking for the club and its athletes. Therefore, a sport interpreter is not the only to convey a message in several languages, but figures such as the coach, the athlete, and the journalist with the necessary language skills can replace it and represent themselves the linguistic bridge.